This is the PAM 560. Base model Panerai, 44 millimeter Luminor Betterini case, 8 days hand wound manual in-house movement, and it's got the see-through case back, which you can see there. And the watch is water resistant to a depth of 300 meters. However, perhaps the most notable aspect of this watch, and the one I'd like to talk about today, is the fact that this one has a painted dial. Now with Panerais, you're going to hear terms for watches that look like this, like painted, filled, sausage dial. There are subtle differences between them, but similar end effect. And for this one, filled is probably the most accurate indication of what happened with what they did with the construction here, which is that they beveled out the dial and filled it with luminescent material. But regardless of which term, which exact construction method, the end result is something that looks like this, which is a flattish watch face with the appearance that the the numerals were simply painted onto the dial. Now, why is that notable? Well, as you may know, Panerai is almost certainly more famous for the sandwich dial, the other type of dial that they offer. And if you're not familiar with the sandwich dial, basically what you'd have there is you'd start with a dial like this, but where the indices are, they would have stenciled or cut out all the way through the dial. And then that dial would be rested on a luminescent disc, and that disc would be what provides the numerals color as well as the glowing effect in darker lighting conditions. The result also is that when you look at it from kind of straight on like this, it would probably look fairly similar, though there would most likely be more hint of depth to it. But once you turn it to the side, then the numerals would recess out of view and you would be left looking at the shadowy outlines of where the numerals used to be, which is certainly a unique effect, very cool, and draws a lot of people to the brand. Now, if you're reading online, pretty much any thread or post from the last 5 or 10 years, people are overwhelmingly going to favor the sandwich dial. Now, those opinions can range from an appreciation of both the sandwich and painted dial, while feeling the sandwich is just more interesting, has a bit more going on, maybe more historically true to form, while the more extreme side would say, the sandwich dial is a core component of Panerai DNA. You are absolutely missing out if you don't have it. So you should definitely be getting a sandwich dial, at least for the first Panerai and maybe for all of them. Now that brings us to this watch, which the PAM 560. It has an interesting and somewhat notorious path through that dichotomy of sandwich and painted. And that's because when this model was introduced in 2014, I believe, and for the 2 years after that, every single one of these watches was produced with the sandwich dial. Now, you would have thought that would be a smash hit, right? I mean, base model PAM, longer power reserve sandwich dial, what's not to love? Well, that's a different story. There were still debates about the in-house versus ETA movement, whether this 8 days logo on the watch is unsightly. But you can't please everybody. But apparently you also can't please the folks at Panerai, because after those 2 years, they switched this model design, the dial, to the painted look, which you see here. And that was a decision that was met with a lot of ire, certainly in the online community, and I would imagine most Panerai enthusiasts felt, or would agree that that seems to be a step back in design. And when trying to understand exactly why that happened, there's not a lot of satisfying reasons to suggest maybe this was in the best interest of the watch. Probably the leading theory was it was cost cutting, which certainly doesn't have any positive associations to it. Others might have said, how much could they really have been saving by doing that? So maybe it wasn't all about cost cutting per se on this model, but it was still a business decision because it would have reserved the sandwich dial for the higher end models, which would drive people in that direction. Again, good for the bottom line, not so good if you were hoping this was made in the best decision or the best interest of this watch. I personally would love to know, what were the guys at Panerai thinking, especially in the design team? Was there anybody there who at least felt like, well, hey, this dial, this painted dial that we came up with, is actually pretty good. It really works on this model. Maybe it's even a step up. That's probably wishful thinking, though. At the end of the day, for guys like me, for anybody considering this model or other painted dials, you're not going to find a lot of support saying, sandwich is the way to, or sorry, that painted is the way to go. Sandwich is the preference. So I've owned this watch for about a month now, a little more than a month, and that's why I wanted to make this video, because I too was absolutely drawn in by the mystique of the sandwich dial. But this is the first Panerai I own. I didn't have any personal experience, but I was still pulled in that direction towards sandwich. And I've got to be honest, if I walked into the boutique and they still had, one of the original ones from a few years ago lying around new with the sandwich dial, or this 560, I almost certainly would have chosen the sandwich dial. And actually, the gentleman working at the boutique was wearing this model with the sandwich. And there were certainly times when he moved his wrist to the side and those shadowy crevices were visible, and I thought, that is a pretty freaking cool watch. That looks really good. So no doubt it does have that effect. But that was not a choice for me to make. I walked out with this one, and I have to admit, maybe it's my personality. I had moments of second guessing myself. I'll probably second guess it again in the future. But the more time I've had with this, the more I've been able to really form an opinion about this watch, this design, the painted dial, without the distraction of, should I go painted or sandwich? So I wanted to make this video to talk about that. The first thing I'd like to start with is the more objective part of this, which is what is actually going on with this dial, because I know there's a conception that it's really flat. So when you're outside in the bright sunlight and the sun is shining directly onto this watch, basically the dial will take on kind of a pitch black, almost bright, maybe shiny is the word, appearance. And the numerals will be absolutely burning. They really pop, but the appearance will indeed be quite flat. Any hint of texture, depth is kind of washed away. You're going to look at a fairly flat surface. Now, throughout the day, as you're wearing this, catching it in different lighting, moving your wrist around, you will notice this effect of something going on with the dial. These hints of an outline, occasional appearance of depth. It's almost happening below the conscious level, but you're going to know it's there, and you will pick it up sometimes, more apparently, that there's some sort of texture to the watch. Now, in other times, you will find yourself in lighting conditions, most likely in reasonably well-lit indoor rooms with natural lighting, where all of a sudden it's really apparent that there is a 3D effect to some degree. Obviously, this is nothing like the sandwich dial, but basically it's clear that they've beveled out the dial, filled it with superluminova, and you can clearly see it didn't go up to the top, so you've got those ridges, that outline around the numerals and indices, which is really interesting to look at. It looks really nice, and it's kind of a pleasant surprise when all of a sudden you realize, oh, there I am. I'm in that, one of those situations where this really pops out. So it's very cool, and I thought that was one thing I really would like to highlight, just so people understand exactly what is going on with this construction and the subtle effects going on there. But that brings me to the next point, which is, am I kind of reaching here? If we have to look that hard to see some depth, shouldn't we just be getting a sandwich dial to begin with? And that's where I've grown to appreciate that these really are two different things. If you're reading about this online and haven't personally owned it or haven't personally experienced it, it's almost going to seem like the sandwich dial and the painted dial are presented on this spectrum of good to better, with sandwich dial just being better. As if we were talking about car engines with one more powerful than the other. Of course, the more powerful engine is better. It can do everything the weaker one can do and more. But what I'm really realizing is they're both just different. It's a personal decision. Do you want a blue car or red car, black or silver? Would it be a little unconventional to be riding around in a lime green Mercedes-Benz? Well, probably, but I think at least in that case, with the color of a car, we can appreciate its personal preference, and it's going to work for some people, and maybe it should even work for more people if they kind of opened up their mind to it and saw it that way, that it's really just up to them. There is no better. Now, the sandwich dial I don't want to take away from it because it's really cool. It's really unique. You can't get that effect of the shadowy crevices on this watch. It's not going to happen. So there's a trade-off. At the same time, you can't get this effect on the sandwich dial, which is that as you're moving your wrist towards you and away from you, the dial, the numerals are always popping off the dial, even as this crystal's kicking in. It's just a different look. It's one that I think is good. If we were talking about this watch on its own, without any other comparison, I think many would agree that this is a beautiful, well-constructed, really interesting watch to look at. So if you've got that design decision that looks good, it's good design. And if you don't have that, it's a trade-off to move away from it. At least that's the way I see it. So that is, that's something that's really kind of stuck with me now is that this really works on its own, in its own right. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that if you find threads from further back, say 2010 and earlier, granted, there's not many of them, and the number of the comments, the length of this discussion is not huge, but it's interesting because there's actually back then almost more of a, I won't say more of a preference, but I will say more representation of people who like the painted dial, and in some case it comes out the winner on the threads. And it's just really interesting how that may have changed over time. And the other thing is, when it comes to what is more historically accurate? Well, this case did not always exist, this case shape. And I believe when it first came out in the early 90s, the dials were painted. So if we're going to sort of acknowledge that this case shape is legitimate and not say, oh, you should never get this case shape because it's not historically accurate, well, what about the fact that the dial was originally painted? And that is most historically true to this case shape. So that's not for me to decide, but it is something I've realized that in the quest for legitimizing our preferences, it seems like a lot of us end up going down this road of trying to tie things to things we feel are objective and can't be argued, and historical accuracy is one of those. But it gets muddy because really, if we wanted historical accuracy, there would only be one watch, the first one they made, and you would not see these other variations. And once the variations do come into play, you've really just got to trust your gut and go with what looks interesting to you. I think that's the main moral of the story here and what I've learned. And, even with this watch, for the painted supporters, a lot of times that's brought up in the context of legibility, which, okay, that is true. The watch is more legible from this angle than the sandwich is. But how much of how many of us are really checking our watch time, looking at the watch like this? Let's be honest, that's the point of wearing a wristwatch, is you can just turn your wrist and look at it head on. So even then, I feel like, even though those guys are kind of on my side, talking or, complimenting my watch, it still seems to be kind of reaching for something to legitimize that preference. And I really just don't think that's necessary, because I think the watch does work on its own right. If you like this look, you would have to get the painted dial. And if you prefer the sandwich look, you would get the sandwich dial. So, that's what I wanted to, why I wanted to make this video. There are obviously other videos out there that show this this model in particular, both painted and sandwich. But, for example, on the channels that are selling watches, I don't think this is a topic they really want to dwell on. It's more of a distraction. For people who own a sandwich watch before this came out, obviously they wouldn't have an opinion because this model came later. But even those that are aware of the switch, they kind of, they'll almost warn against this model, which I felt like it might be useful to take a little more time to try to appreciate what makes this interesting. Not better, just interesting, what makes it work on its own right. And also, if you've never seen these up close, just give you a chance to really see again, what this watch looks like up close, different lighting conditions. So hopefully you found this useful. And, thanks for watching. I'm enjoying the watch, and, maybe we'll make some more videos someday about as my opinions continue to evolve. So thanks again.